if we look at the shared principles, which is really kind of the first concepts that we explore within the arrangement. What I want to start with is when we were tasked to begin these discussions, we were given certain mandates to look at. First of all, mandate number one was existing treaties are sacred and connect the Mi'kmaq to their ancestors and their nation and are protected under Section 35 of the Constitution. Therefore, we were clearly instructed that we were not to explore anything that would look like a modern day treaty, would not explore anything that would take away from the existence or validity of the existing covenant chain of treaties. Number two, any arrangement should recognize and implement Section 35 rights and treaties and not define, extinguish, invalidate, or replace them. So what that means is the treaty rights exist. Section 35 rights exist. We don't need anything to tell us that that's true. What we need to know is how can we implement them in a national park in a way that takes conservation as a key priority and takes the public safety of people who are in a national park in priority. In other words, if you're hunting in a national park, it's different than if you're hunting outside a national park. There are millions of visitors that go in and out of national parks and historic sites every year. So how do you do these things in a way that's not going to lead to dangerous situations? Number three, Mi'kmaq should be recognized as a government in determining how and by whom their resources are protected and accessed. I think one of the keys is we were told directly to avoid anything that would be a comprehensive claim and to avoid anything that would be a self-government agreement. The fortunate thing is with Parks Canada, they don't have these policies. So we were able to look at the arrangement outside of policy parameters. Nothing in the arrangement talks about how internally the Mi'kmaq will determine their governance structure or the way that they make decisions. What the arrangement talks about is ultimately the Mi'kmaq have equal decision-making abilities along with the minister, but how the Mi'kmaq come to those decisions is the business of the Mi'kmaq. It's not the business of Parks Canada. So nothing within this arrangement explains or determines or suggests how the Mi'kmaq as a governance structure will develop that. Number four, Mi'kmaq should be able to develop a collective government without affecting the current band structure. I fully understand the realities of what we are. We have 13 communities, and you as chiefs and councils of those 13 communities have obligations and responsibilities to your community members. We also have Section 35 rights exercised by each and every one of your community members and equally exercised by each of your community members, regardless of which community they come from. So how do we strike a balance between community autonomy and community say versus rules or understandings that everyone will live by when they operate with national parks? I'd like to say I solved that, or we solved that, but I don't think we need to solve that. That's a governance question that the Mi'kmaq will determine going forward for decades and decades and decades. How the Mi'kmaq determine their own band autonomy and community understandings within their governance structure is only the business of the Mi'kmaq. It's not the business of parks, and it's not the business of anyone else. So under this arrangement, the Mi'kmaq, as they go forward and as they determine how those things work, that's what they'll bring to the table. So the arrangement. There's direct language within the arrangement that indicates that the Dokim Maleaptamuk arrangement is not a treaty pursuant to Section 35. It's an implementation arrangement pursuant to already existing Section 35 Mi'kmaq treaties. It doesn't define the rights. And by that I mean, simply because the Mi'kmaq are indicating that they wish to implement their rights in this way for a certain period of time does not mean that the Mi'kmaq have defined these rights for the rest of time. It simply means for a number of years, the Mi'kmaq will do this. At the end of the 10 years, or even before the 10 years is up, the Mi'kmaq may decide they want to do it differently. And in that case, the Mi'kmaq have the right and the ability to do it differently. Number two, it's time limited. And what we mean by that is it's designed to simply operate for a certain period of time. When we had discussions at previous nationhood conferences where we talked about the parks arrangement, and we had discussions at our park symposiums, which were where representatives and knowledge holders and elders from the communities came together to talk about parks, what was felt is we needed to find a period of time that allowed us to do the work we need to do and set up the relationships we need to set up, but didn't bind people for an incredibly long time. And so that's when it was suggested to us that we look at 10 years. So what we've got in the arrangement at this point is a period of 10 years that the arrangement would be in place. Having said that, if during that 10-year period, the Mi'kmaq don't like the way that the arrangement is going forward, they can get out of the arrangement with 1 year's written notice. Once 1 year's written notice is given, the parties can get together and try to find if there are ways to work out the differences on the way that they, on whatever issue it is that they have. And if they can't work out the differences, then the arrangement comes to an end. And we're back to where we are today. Within the arrangement is the concept that individual bands can make decisions. Individual chiefs and councils can make decisions on whether they wish to be part of it or not be part of it. Individual bands can be part of it and get out of it if they so wish. We fully understand that we need to preserve the autonomous ability of communities to make decisions they feel important for their community members and not be bound by the decisions of other communities. In the case of some communities being in and some communities being out, it'll be up to Parks Canada and the Mi'kmaq to determine whether or not they can proceed with that particular situation. I think the final thing that I want to say on that as well is, because this is a question actually I heard from community members who brought it forward. If we've done all of these things, we've done things on archaeology, we've done things on harvest, we've done things on cultural input into Parks Canada, what is it about this which would get us further down the road? Why do we need this? Can't we just simply do things as we've been doing them? And I'll address that a bit all the way through and just try to highlight to you things that are new in this arrangement that take us to that next level. But the one thing I'd like to say first and foremost is, at some point, you're able to do things with certain people. And we've been fortunate in Nova Scotia. And I know some of the communities have had dealings with parks, and they've been positive dealings. With the field superintendent in Cape Breton and the field superintendent in the mainland. What we're worried about is people come and go. You can have good relationships with one person and suddenly you have a new field superintendent and you're losing all of the things that you gained. Governments come and go. So you've got a good relationship with a certain government and a certain minister, but suddenly you have a new government and a new minister, and they have different ideas of what relationship should happen between Mi'kmaq and Parks on these things. So it's come to the point where we realize we need to formalize the gains that we've made. We need to take the next step, particularly in the co-governance and co-management area, so that new governments or new people coming in don't have the ability to erode away some of the things that we've done. So the main components of the arrangement, we have general provisions, and those are a lot of the legal provisions that we talk about, things like protections of the treaties, things like this agreement not being a treaty, things like acceptance of UNDRIP and the principles behind UNDRIP, and that they will form the principles of how this goes forward, recognition of Mi'kmaq cases like Marshall and Simon and others that have been important in the way that rights have been promoted in Nova Scotia. As well, we set up the shared principles, and I think the video gave a good understanding of what the shared principles are, that the arrangement is going to be looked at not just through a Parks lens, but it's going to be looked through a Mi'kmaq lens. Third, the Cooperative Management Board, which we'll go into in more detail. Fourth, Archaeological Co-Governance. Fifth, Culture and Heritage Co-Governance. Sixth, Natural Resources Co-Governance. And seventh, Economic Opportunities. Okay. So again, in the whereas clauses, acknowledgement of existing treaties and advancement of self-determination. The arrangement is to be consistent with UNDRIP and a vehicle to implement UNDRIP principles. Acknowledgement of the Mi'kmaq court decisions and rights implementation is a key part of reconciliation. You can't have reconciliation until you recognize that Mi'kmaq have rights throughout Mi'kma'ki, that the parks did not set up special little places where those rights don't exist. So in the general provisions, we talk about it not being a new treaty, which I've discussed, but we keep hammering that home because that's a lot of my discussion with community members. The third part is, I want to discuss this a bit, the arrangement is binding on the parties while it's in effect. What we want to try to avoid is the need for Mi'kmaq to constantly be spending time and resources on court actions to try to get recognition of their rights. That it should be the obligation of government to properly sit down with Mi'kmaq and determine how Mi'kmaq wish their rights to be implemented. And every time Mi'kmaq go to court and want to talk about a single issue, government wants to go in and talk about, is this going to be the court case we can try to chisel away at the treaty rights? Is this the court case that we can try to minimize the Section 35 rights? We want to get away from that. It should be a situation where if there is a true nation-to-nation relationship, as I read the treaties, the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq and the ancestors of government agreed that they would get together and determine how these things should be implemented in a government-to-government, nation-to-nation way. That's not done through court. That's done by each nation sitting down together with equal decision-making. Implementation is through the arrangement. Next one. So that's really the point, is while this is in effect, you should not have to go to court to have your rights implemented in parks. If there is a difficulty, we should be able to use the arrangement in making sure that the implementation happens in a way that's suitable for you. And we'll talk about, as we get into the co-management board, the way this discussion will happen and the way that those elements will be determined. However, I think it's important that sometimes there are need for Mi'kmaq to go to court to make sure government is doing what they're supposed to do. So within this, we developed sections that ensure that if government is not living up to their obligations or not doing the things that they need to do, Mi'kmaq can go to court to challenge ministerial decisions that are inconsistent with what we're doing. The term of the arrangement, the time limited for 10 years, and we talked about the ability to terminate the arrangement and withdraw from the arrangement. What we heard from communities, what we heard from our symposiums, what I heard from nationhood conferences is, it is always critical to Mi'kmaq to be able to get out of something if they don't like it. And so it always becomes a double-edged sword. You would love to bind parks for an awfully long time so that they would have to be within the arrangement. But at the same time, you don't want to bind yourself if you're just not happy with the way the arrangement is working. So at this point in time, I think it's important that the parties determine whether or not things are working. And if it's not working, then go back and see what else will work. And again, it's a bit unique in this arrangement because we deviated from what normally would be in an arrangement like this by trying to spell out what the shared principles are. Because we felt it was important. It's one thing to sit there and say Mi'kmaq values will become an important part of the way that this document is interpreted. But I think it's important to try to explain what some of those Mi'kmaq values are. And this is where I've got to say it was very helpful to have my discussions with the Grand Chief because I know we want to use Mi'kmaq terminology. We want to use Mi'kmaq words to explain or express what Mi'kmaq concepts are instead of always trying to find English ways of putting it forward. At the same time, in my discussions with the Grand Chief, it's a concern of not wanting to define what Mi'kmaq terms are, because Mi'kmaq terms can mean different things in different contexts. And it's important not to try to pin something down when something was not necessarily meant to be pinned down. And so what we've tried to do within this document is, instead of defining Mi'kmaq terms, what we're doing is developing a glossary of Mi'kmaq terms where we can just simply explain what a concept is about without indicating that this is how it is defined within this agreement. That took a bit of doing with Parks Canada, who wanted to see definitions of terms that are in an agreement. And what we told them is, we're not going to define it. You're just going to have to be happy with the Mi'kmaq expressing themselves the way they wish to express themselves within the agreement. And maybe you should hire more Mi'kmaq speakers and they can try to explain to you what it means as you're going forward. Or listen to Mi'kmaq when you're at the co-management board and they will explain to you what it means going forward. So let me go into the co-governance board. So what this does is it sets up the Dohi Maliaptamuk board. What the board is it is a body of 7 people. 3 of those people are appointed by the Mi'kmaq. 3 of those people are appointed by Parks Canada. And both parties get together to select a chair. The only thing we've determined about who those people are is nobody on the board can be a chief. And I'll explain why going forward when we talk about how things are ultimately approved, because chiefs are ultimately on the approval approval panel, and you can't recommend to yourself and approve what you want to have done. But other than that, it can be anyone. It can be anyone from the community that the Mi'kmaq feel is important. It can be knowledge holders. It can be elders. It can be academics. It can be youth. Anyone who the Mi'kmaq will feel have a perspective to bring on the way that parks are managed from that level. The board is responsible to both the assembly and the minister in making recommendations. What that means is that they will make a single recommendation, and they will make that single recommendation to both the assembly and the minister. The minister will go internally to figure out what they feel about the recommendation. The assembly will go internally to figure out what it feels about the recommendation. Ultimately, both parties have to agree to a recommendation for it to go forward. So, if the minister would agree, but the assembly would disagree, what the arrangement indicates is the parties then have to sit down and discuss why it is that one party disagrees with the recommendation. And the parties try to work out whatever that disagreement might be. Right now, I believe Parks is under ECCC. Okay. Parks is one of those places that doesn't have a single minister. They fall under another department. And right now, I think it's ECCC. Ultimately, then, what's hoped is the parties can come up with an agreement on the recommendation, and it may make changes to the recommendation. The board may have put something forward, and the assembly decides that they want to tweak it a little bit to make it better suit what they would like. The assembly has full authority to do that. Ultimately, if it comes down to the parties disagreeing and they can't come up with a resolution in the way that they work it out, they can always, if they choose, appoint a mediator. The mediator can try to help them work it through. What we've suggested, and this was after discussions with Chief Norman Bernard about the way things work with the new court in Wagmatcook, is looking at probably the creation of an elder panel as the mediators. So I think in the classic Western way of looking at it, you go out, you find some lawyer, they become the mediator for things, and they go through. In this situation, we want to look at something different, which would be bringing community elders or knowledge holders together and have them become the mediators and see if they can work it through. Ultimately, if people don't agree, the recommendations of the board can't go forward because there's not agreement from both parties, and that's what it requires. Within the board, there is the ability for dissenting opinions. What we felt was important is that you've got the 6 board members in the chair. What if there was one board member who just didn't agree with the decision or the recommendation being made by the board? We wanted to give that person the ability to explain to the decision makers why it is they didn't agree with the recommendation being made. Because it may be that the assembly looks at the dissenting opinion and decides that seems like a very good concern, and that influences the way that we look at it. It calls for the creation of technical committees. So the board is really looking for recommendations from the technical committees on how it wants to go forward. Under the arrangement, there are 3 standing technical committees that have to be in place. Number 1 is natural resources, so hunting, fishing, gathering. Number 2 is culture, heritage, and language. And number 3 is archaeology. So each of those technical committees would be made up of representatives from the Mi'kmaq and representatives from Parks. They would put together plans or protocols on how these things can work, how these things would work on the ground, what considerations the board needs to make when it makes decisions on these, and they would pass that up to the board. And finally, the creation of a youth forum. So one of the critical parts of the governance of this is a youth forum will be created. It mandates that a youth will be selected from each of the communities, plus two members at large. So the assembly can determine how they want to look at the two members at large. Do they want to look at urban youth? Do they want to look at different aspects of things on representation? That's fully up to the Mi'kmaq on how they do that. The youth forum will get together once a year. It will be chaired by the chair of the Dohi Maliaptamuk co-management board, and they will provide input and advice into what they think the board should be looking at. So it's a way of youth to start providing their input into the way that parks are managed in that cooperative arrangement. It also lets youth start getting involved in the way the governance structures work and the way that these processes work, because they'll be the ones, of course, taking over from the technical committees and the board going forward. So that's the initial presentation on the board structure. As I said, the board structure is a key component of this because this is something that we currently do not have with parks. Currently, parks, like other federal government departments, we have advisory capacity where we can advise parks on what to do, but it's still ultimately the sole decision of the minister on whether or not they listen to that. They can go into consultation and we can consult with parks, but it still will be solely up to parks as to whether they implement what they hear in consultation. The importance of what's in the arrangement is this now takes us to the next step where parks is agreeing the minister has to go into a cooperative decision-making process with the Mi'kmaq. And the minister can't make decisions on things that are within this agreement without the consent of the Mi'kmaq. That's a huge step forward. That's a step forward that we don't have with any other government department, provincial or federal, and a step which other federal departments say that they cannot take. But here we have a federal department that suddenly says this is a step they can take. So one of the hopes is not only does this start creating a legitimate equal relationship with parks, but does it become a precedent that we can start using with other federal departments to say, if parks can share decision-making, then why can't DFO share decision-making? Why can't ECCC share decision-making? Why can't provincial departments share decision-making instead of being advisory?